Great, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for having me today. Thank you so much to those of you who are here in person and those of you who are joining us online as well. So if you're joining us online, just so I can paint a picture for you, we're in a beautiful co-working space in downtown Fort Myers called the Collaboratory. It's a wonderful shared space. Also, we have snacks. So unfortunately, I'm happy you're here, but you are missing out if you are joining us virtually. You're missing out on the snacks. So my name is Sara Ayers-Rigsby. I'm going to talk a little bit about archaeological sites and historical sites in the area and how they're being impacted by climate change. So if I could get the next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So I work for the Florida Public Archaeology Network. What is that? We're a statewide educational organization. Our mission is education and outreach, so doing things like talking to school groups. We assist local governments as well, and we assist the State Division of Historical Resources. So I'm the director for the Southeast and Southwest regions. I cover every single county south of Lake Okeechobee, so about 50% of Florida's population. And an area that's going to be very impacted by sea level rise. And we're hosted over at Florida Atlantic University on their Davie campus. So thank you, next slide, please. So for those of you who might not know that much about archaeology, archaeology is the study of the past through the things people leave behind. So we're trying to tell the story of Florida. So if you're not familiar with local archaeology, the archaeological record in Southwest Florida goes back at least 8,000 years. But we know that people have been living in Florida for 14,000 years. And I think Jill just really hammered home that point. So when we think about the value of archaeology, right, archaeology shows us this story of resiliency, because 14,000 years ago, right, Florida was a completely different place. It was twice as wide as it is now. The Gulf Coast extended. The climate was significantly cooler and drier. So people who are adjusting to the transition to Florida's modern climate change can provide a message of resiliency. So I always like to say Florida's been a great place to live for 14,000 years, and we want to make it a great place to live for the next 14,000 years. There's also an economic value to archaeology and history, right? So heritage tourism is actually a $6 billion industry for the state, so billion with a B. So in addition to it being interesting and valuable from a human and academic point, there's also an economic value. So thank you. Next slide, please. So why does prioritization matter? Next slide, please. Thank you. So how do we prioritize these sites? How do we decide which sites are important and what we're going to focus on first when we think about the impacts of climate change? So here we have on the left, that is a pre-contact site that's located in Pineland at the Renzel Research Center. So it's a pre-contact mound. In the middle, we have the Edison and Ford Winter Estates, right? A historic site, a major tourist attraction, something that's associated with the big name. And on the far right, we have downtown Fort Myers, which is, of course, another historic site. So the people in the room, you guys can participate, so I can make sure everyone in here is staying awake. Who would choose, if you could only say one of these sites, who would choose the archaeological site? Raise your hand. Oh, thank you, thank you. There's like three ladies and three people chose the archaeological site. Who would choose to say the Edison and Ford Winter Estates? Okay, okay, good. I see a number of you. And who would prioritize downtown Fort Myers? Raise your hand. Oh, so we had quite the spread of answers there. And I noted some people did not vote, so that's okay. That's okay. So one of the things I did with my colleagues, Rachel Kangas, who's with FPEN and our USF campus, and with Dr. Mike Savarese from Florida Gulf Coast University, who will be speaking later today, is we tried to implement a system and involve a variety of stakeholders to try and make some of these decisions, right? To try and decide how we would prioritize these sites, to try and deal with this preservation bias. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we used a GeoTool. So the GeoTool is called Acute. It's a web-based package of tools for assessing the vulnerability of Collier County to seawater inundation caused by sea level rise, tides, storm surge, and waves. So in 2017, a multidisciplinary institutional science team led by Dr. Peter Sheng from the University of Florida and an end user team led by Dr. Michael Savarese from FGCU began development for the cultural resource vulnerability assessment. So for this, we used Acune compound flood maps for both sea level rise, nuisance tides, and sea level rise and storms. So we were able to look at multiple factors, right? So we use these compound models. So next slide, please. So we started out looking at how archaeological sites would be impacted in two different scenarios. So one of the challenges that we have with looking at archaeological sites in Florida is that the locational information is actually protected by law. So you can only see where archaeological sites are going to be impacted if you are an archaeologist or you have access to that information. So that makes it a little more tricky for us to collaborate with climate scientists because they have to receive special approval for this. So we looked at a count of sites for all the archaeological sites in Collier County. There are about 800. So of those 800 sites, when we modeled the ones that would be impacted with a 1% flood, it was about 267 sites. But when we looked at a 2030 medium sea level rise model in Acuna with the same 1% AEP flood, 318 sites would be impacted, right? So which model you are using and which data set you're using is really going to impact the number of archaeological sites. But spoiler alert, as we get into the future and as we get into higher probability or high risk, the situation obviously does not improve for archaeological sites, right? It's not like in 2100 everything looks beautiful. Next slide, please. So what we did for this project, we looked at smaller case studies. So we did a count for all 800 sites, and then we looked at how 10 specific sites in Collier County that were very important to the community would be impacted over a range of different scenarios. So this group involved land managers, academic archaeologists, museum professionals, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, the NAACP, the Coalition of Immokalee Farm Workers, and residents, right? So we wanted all these people at the table. And I think Jill did a great job of talking about involving different communities and involving the tribe and other stakeholders early in the process. So for this, so the 10 sites that were decided upon as most important or as most significant by these groups were Dismal Key, which is an archaeological site, the Everglades City Museum, the Everglades Laundry, Fakahatchee, which is another archaeological site, the Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church, the River Park, which is in the River Park community, the Marco Island Historical Museum, the Ochoape Post Office, which is the smallest post office in the United States. If you've never been, we see a picture of it on the right there. Otter Mound, which is a publicly accessible park on Marco Island, the Shell Island site, another archaeological site, and the Smallwood store in Everglades City. Next slide, please. So everyone in this room can read, and I want to make sure that we have enough time for questions. So for these 10 sites that I just listed, we assigned them a different score based on these factors, right? So we have exposure, so how extensive will the flooding be on the resource, sensitivity, so will the site be impacted by flooding, its adaptive capacity. So for something like that, can the resource be modified? So something that's a massive shell work site, that is going to have a very low adaptive capacity, whereas something like the world's smallest post office, something you can pick up and move pretty easily, that's going to potentially have a high adaptive capacity. Consequence, environmental, social. So is this going to have an impact? Something like the Macedonia Missionary Baptist Church, it's very important to the River Park community that that church stays where it is. So even though it would be technically possible to move it, you're going to have a negative social consequence to doing that. And obviously economic consequences as well. So we looked at all of those factors. And this was based on a vulnerability assessment done by the city of Naples following different categories established by the DEP. Next slide, please. So we looked at, all the different interest groups that I mentioned, all the different stakeholder groups, looked at exposure using these 13 different scenarios that you see listed above. And I really have to emphasize that having the Accune tool be so accessible and something that people could use made an incredible difference in how we were able to model these sites. Because instead of working with a stakeholder group and then going back to the Accune team and saying, hey, could you please model all these sites for us? All the stakeholders were able to actually access that data and to model the impact to each individual site. So thank you. Next slide, please. So this is Rosemary Cemetery. This is what it looks like in the Accune tool in that 2100 high flooding scenario. So you can see that the cemetery is impacted. Next slide, please. So here is a photo of what the cemetery looks like today. And this site was actually not impacted until much later scenarios, right? So of the 13 scenarios we analyzed that I showed in the previous slide, it's only impacted in 2 of those scenarios. But that doesn't mean we can ignore Rosemary Cemetery today, right? It is a cemetery and we know eventually that it's going to be impacted. So the time for planning and coming up with an assessment and an approach, that time is now, right? That time is not in 2100 when the cemetery is covered with water. So thank you. Next slide, please. Oh, so I just want to thank the following people. So these are the different end user teams who actually looked at the tool and helped us analyze the different case studies that we talked about and in these 13 different scenarios to come up with a list of when we need to address how we approach different sites. So for a major archaeological site, a method of addressing that could be excavating it so we get that information, right? So we know who was using the site and when. For something like a keep on, I don't want to throw the world's smallest post office under the bus, but we could probably move that if I had to choose something. And I also have our different author contacts. So I have my email and then emails from my co-authors, Rachel Kangas and Dr. Severis, who will be talking later today. And I think I finished a minute early. All right, so I have the microphone. So if you go to menti.com and you enter in the code, I will be able to answer your questions. So one of the questions is, do we work with the Miccosukee? And we actually have approached the Miccosukee in the past, and I would be interested in working with them more in the future. Mike is saying, hi, Sarah, nice job. Let them know we have a report available. Thanks, Mike. Oh, thanks, Mike. Yes. So we did all these assessments using the Accune tool. We have a report available. So we're happy to share it. So the report details the approach we used using the Accune tool, how many archaeological sites were impacted, and then it goes into the detail of these very specific case studies. So you can actually go through and see all the modeling we used and the impacts to different sites and with these 13 different scenarios. So thanks, Mike. I buried the lead there. Yeah, I'm here because we wrote a report, y'all. So how do you preserve underwater sites like near Minnesota Key in the Gulf or Warm Mineral and Little Salt Spring? So for preservation of underwater sites, oh, this is fascinating. This could be a whole other paper. I'll try and keep it brief because I know I'm standing between everyone and lunch. So when we think about underwater sites, if you're someone who works in climate policy, if you're a terrestrial archaeologist, sometimes you don't necessarily even consider the impacts of things that are already submerged, right? Because it's like, this is already underwater, it's just going to become increasingly underwater. However, as with ocean acidification, with increased ocean temperatures, this is actually going to have a negative impact to archaeological sites as well. So archaeological sites, when they are first covered by water, there is an incredible transformation that happens in them initially, but over time, they reach essentially like a stasis with the water environment. So the water can help preserve them over time, but it only helps to preserve them if that environment rate remains constant. So as we see things like water temperatures changing and the chemical composition of the ocean changing, this is going to deteriorate our archaeological sites as well. So that's a great question. Rachel says she's going to link the report in the comments. Guys, I have the greatest co-authors in the world. I'm glad they're here for me. How many Native American sites are there in Florida? So we know that there are, I'm not sure how many pre-contact sites there are specifically. Overall, I know that with 3 feet of sea level rise, over 16,015 archaeological and historical sites across the state will be impacted. So, which of the Indiana Jones movies is your favorite? Definitely Last Crusade. Easy question, easy question. For coastal sites with shell middens or old pottery tools, what do you do in preparation for sea level rise? Do you protect them or just document before they're covered? So that's an excellent question, and you can do both. So I worked pretty extensively at the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse Outstanding Natural Area. They have experienced rapid shoreline loss and in a rate of like 4 to 5 feet per year or after major storms. So they recently installed a living shoreline along their southern coast to try and protect and stabilize the area. And also, if you are excavating, let's say there's no possible way to save the site, nothing is going to be able to protect it, then excavation might be your only option. So you would want to work in collaboration with descendant communities. And what I would like is for archaeologists to consider climate change as an adverse impact, right? In the same way, if you are going to build a condo or a bridge or something else on top of an archaeological site, there is work that you have to do to make sure that it's documented. I would like us to view climate change in the same way. Do artifacts stay in place when possible, but then moved if at risk for sea level rise? Oh, that's a great question. So one of the programs we do with the Florida Public Archaeology Network is called Heritage Monitoring Scouts. So we actually train members of the public to go out and document sites that are being lost due to erosion and sea level rise. But this program, even if we see artifacts, we just take photos of them and we don't collect them, right? Because when you collect an artifact, you have a responsibility to take care of that artifact for forever. So it's for the lifetime of the artifact, not your very, by comparison, minuscule lifetime. So when we see them, we try and document the severity and the number of artifacts that are eroding or that are being exposed. But unfortunately, we don't necessarily have the resources, right, to collect and document everything and send it to a museum. Someone asked about Indiana Jones. I always like to say that the only accurate part of Indiana Jones is the giant warehouse full of boxes at the end of Raiders. That's pretty much what our facilities look like. So, so I see it's 12:10 and I have a microphone, but I'm going to be responsible and give it back. So thank you all again so much, and thanks.